So I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of open source in financial services today, and it's a bit of a weird topic, to be honest, because it's such a broad subject, right? Like when I was thinking about this, I work at Red Hat, so we think a lot about infrastructure and how you make infrastructure work and platforms. But I used to be a front-end developer, and that's drowning in open source software. You've got all the NPM, all the Node, like Python. I mean, it's such a huge ecosystem that I'm going to just try and cover some high-level points in 15 minutes, and hopefully you take something valuable away from it. Before we talk about where we are today, sometimes it's useful to look back and just think about the history of sort of open source and just more generally like openness. That's open standards, open communities. A lot of this stuff came from Linux, right? So if you think back to kind of corporate IT back in, I don't know, the 80s, like probably in the 90s, so heavily dependent on proprietary software, you know, like Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, they had a chokehold on the whole industry. And Linux was the thing that cracked that thing open, right? So moving from proprietary Unix platforms to Linux was the thing that started where, like, we wouldn't all be here today, I don't think, if it wasn't for Linux and for like Linus and all the stuff that he did to champion sort of open standards. And the slide has like two tracks to it. The top track is like the technology track, if you like, and that's really focused on the platforms. But at the bottom here, you can see how open in terms of like open communities, open APIs, open like connections really kind of comes along with us. So we start with the data center. And as we move along, and especially what you'll see in this presentation, the closer you get to this right-hand side, like, I don't think any of the banks that exist today would exist without open source now, right? I just don't think you could run IT at the scale that it's running today if you were dependent on proprietary vendors. I just don't think it would be possible. I think the cost would be prohibitive. I think innovation would be slow and stagnant. And so as we've kind of progressed down this line, the innovation in open source has enabled that, and so the dependency on open source has increased. You might be thinking that I've lost my mind and I've got the wrong slide in the deck, but just humor me for 1 second, right? All of these cars are based on the same fundamental platform, okay? Like this happens a lot in cars. Like if you buy a Volkswagen or an Audi, they're based on the same bits, yeah? The same, like the chassis and the engine and all the bits that are complicated to make. They make them once and they just put them in tons of cars. I chose slightly nicer cars because I liked the pictures. The point is that they differentiate themselves, like this is a Porsche and a Bentley and another Porsche. They differentiate themselves on the things that you touch, the things that you feel, the things that you see and sit in, right? That's the differentiation they get. It's not like the specific engine or the specific chassis or any of those things, right? They get the differentiation from the customer feeling. And this is really kind of what open source gives you today, right? If you were to try and build like a Linux platform today in your bank, let's say, you would need a kernel engineer who knows about networking and a scheduling engineer in the kernel and all these different roles, and they would be very expensive, they're hard to find, and that doesn't really make you any better as an organization, right? You're no better a bank if you build that distribution of Linux yourself versus buying it from somebody who can provide that for you. And that's kind of the point of open source, right? Like, loads of people are collaborating in these communities, they're innovating in those communities, and you should bring that into your organization, but you should do it in a way that you can maximize the value of it. And often for, especially financial services customers or organizations, it doesn't make sense for you to be in every single community because there's just so many of them and there's so much innovation going on. So what are the trends that are, oh, hey, Katrina. So what are the trends that we're seeing that are really driving open source in financial services? The first one is innovation. Like, we started Linux 25, 30 years ago, right? And the amount of technology now, like, so if you have a graph with proprietary technology, that's going down, and the space that's being left in that graph is being filled by open source innovation, okay? And you think about, we talked about Linux, you think about all those, the front-end development frameworks. Now you think about the data pipelines. And as you get closer to AI, like open source just is the predominant driver of innovation. And as organizations, you want to tap into that innovation. And so access to that, where all that's happening is kind of a big driver. The other thing we're seeing is, I've been a bit sensitive about the slide, but like we're seeing two things. We're seeing increased demand on sovereign cloud. So like, how do I build my own cloud? Because I don't
necessarily want to be dependent on a cloud that could be, like, I mean, there's examples, right, where Microsoft for the have had to have deactivated the email accounts of people who've been seen to be against what the US government want right now. Okay, and that's a problem. Yeah, you don't have control of that data. You don't have control of those systems if they're running elsewhere and they're under different jurisdiction. The private cloud bit is more around virtualization, where we are seeing customers trying to do different things around their virtualization platform. And again, open source is the obvious answer for customers, right? They're going there to find solace. And finally, in data and AI, which I'll come to in a second, because I think there's a really interesting sort of track in data and AI where open source is really the driver of innovation there. So if you think back to January 2023, which may feel like a long time ago now, but actually isn't really that long ago, there were really no open source models, right? So you think about everybody was using ChatGPT, it was all proprietary, they were using these big frontier models, but they were all controlled by a small number of companies. Since 2023 to like now in 2025, the number of models that are now publicly available, freely available through like Hugging Face, for example, has just exploded, right? And what you can see here is that we're not seeing any slowdown in the number of models and the performance of those models. And like the classic is Llama, right? And you can see them up here. They're really up against the top models. In like GPT-4o is here, a slightly small slide. And customers are, what we're seeing now is you don't want to run these models somewhere where you don't have control of them, you don't know where the data is going, you don't know how it's been trained. Your organization is going to want to run them in your data centers, you're going to want to run them where you have control of them, where you know how they're going to operate. And more importantly, you want to get the right thing for the right problem, right? One of the problems with these large frontier models is it has tons of information in it, like billions and trillions of parameters. And it's not really going to help you to do the specific job that you're trying to get that model to do. You want to have a smaller thing, a smaller model, more specifically trained on the problem that you're trying to solve. And again, like these open models give you the ability to do all of that. So you can see here, advantages of these open source models is that you can run a model from 1 billion parameters to 400+ billion parameters, right? Like you can't do that with a ChatGPT or a Claude. They're all these frontier huge models, right? And like the anecdote I use is, if you have a specific use case in your organization, it's going to be quite constrained. It's going to want to do a specific thing. It's like I'm not talking now just about like how do I summarize an email, but like a specific task that you want it to do. The models don't need to know like all those trillions of other parameters to do that job well. And so use the right thing to solve the right problem. And open source models give you that ability to do that. And it also means then when you have smaller, more like constrained things, you can move more quickly. So you can iterate, you can try, you can test and learn. Whereas training a frontier model, even nearly close to that, will take you weeks, if not months, and a huge amount of electricity and compute power. And so there's two parts to this, right? One is how do you kind of make that sensible and make it work for your organization, but also how do you, the innovation that's driving all of this. And so for me, like when I look now at where we are today with open source in financial services, like it's only going to increase, right? If you don't have strategies for open source, if you're not thinking about how to bring in the best of that innovation into your organization, you're going to be left behind by organizations who are using those tools and technologies, because that is where the innovation lies. And the key thing I want to leave you with is it doesn't always have to come from the source community. Because if you have, you're going to be solving huge problems in your organizations, and there's going to be so many solutions to those problems that it's going to be hard for you to pinpoint the right exact community that you need to go and invest in to get the best like bang for your buck. And in a way, the best thing to do is to work with vendors who are working in those open source communities, who are giving you access to the wealth of innovation and the kind of knowledge from those communities, and bringing that to bear on your on the problems that you are trying to solve in your organization. And I think that's really all I wanted to say, because you can't
get into much depth in 15 minutes. Like that's part of the problem with this talk. It's almost like a double-edged sword. Like you could go into lots of depth on the whole subject, but really what I wanted to leave people with is this idea of optimism around open source, the kind of real the foundation that it gives all of our organizations and the things that it enables us all to do. Like we just wouldn't be, the innovation would, we just wouldn't be doing half the things we're doing today without open source. And I think, lean into it, work with vendors who are helping you get access to those communities. There's lots of fledgling organizations that now work so well in the open source, and you can do so much to support those organizations by listening to them, by having conversations, by supporting them. So that's what I wanted to say. But I'm happy to have a discussion with the room and have some questions if anybody's got a view or something they want to share.
So let me first say also you work with others.
Yeah, brilliant. So you're doing your bit already.
But the idea that the big consumers, the governments, the big banks, who have the critical mass to do some of this stuff, should only be dealing with this world through vendors, strikes me as a lost opportunity to make those communities richer in terms of the variety of employers, the stability of the employers. We see some of these little vendors go bang every now and again. Where's the right balance?
Yeah, I was having a conversation before this session, right? So for me, you think about where big tech is, like the FANG organizations, like they contribute piles and piles of stuff into the open source community now. And for them, like an announcement of an open source project for a Facebook or for a Google, like that will make their stock price move, right? Like it has a material impact on them as a business. Like if a bank says they're going to contribute to a project, it doesn't make a material difference to them as an organization. That's my personal opinion on that. And so you're always fighting against the tide if that's the situation. And so for me, it's effectively a buy versus build type conversation that you're trying to have. And my view is that you building something from the constituent components as an organization, like a bank, is not where you want to be focusing your effort, and you're better off like engaging with the community and through a set of vendors who can really they have a bigger impact on those communities because they bring more, like it's force multiplied, right? So if 10 people work with a vendor and they work with 3 communities, they're going to get a lot of support in those 3 communities. Whereas some of the large organizations will create a community that just doesn't get the traction, it doesn't get going in the same way.
Okay, I suppose that does then also go, not create a new project. Project which already exists. To a particular piece of the kernel, to the XML2, for instance, recently just ended up on its own.
Yeah. There's no like concrete answer to that question. Is like some organizations will have people who can do that, but they're going to. My general feeling is organizations want to focus closer to the customer, and that's just the reality of how I see organizations generally engaging with open source communities. That's my personal view on it. But there's no right answer. I think like some people will, some people won't. That's part of the joy of open source to some extent, right? Like it's a community, people can jump in and out. Yeah. Do you want to have
Just to follow up on that comment, I think there's hope there because one, I see certain banks who are present in the room are doing, is they are using open source and the ability to contribute and participate in those projects to attract people in.
Oh, absolutely.
And they're starting to develop open source project offices, they're getting a bit of momentum. The bank's using things like FINOS to actually come in and find a safe way to contribute. And I think we've overcome a lot of the legal issues that we might have had a few years ago to prevent that. So I think this is happening.
Yeah.
It's happening more, and there's a momentum behind FINOS as well to make it happen even faster. And I think that's one of the things that has differentiated, say, this conference today from 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, we are seeing more contribution. Like think about where we are now with, like, people have GitHub page, like people at banks have their own GitHub pages which talk about their contributions. Like that would never have happened 5 years ago. I think that is a positive momentum, right? People are more, it's just more accepting of like the contribution to it, to projects. Yeah.
I think we're seeing it also as a method of attracting talent.
Yeah.
Organizations.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because people want to be able to show what they're working on, right? Like if you work at any of the tech companies, you're going to have an open source presence, and people are going to hire based on what they see and how you operate in those communities. And so banks are at risk of not giving people those opportunities if they don't engage. So I'm definitely not against companies engaging. I guess what I'm trying to get the balance of is, how do you give your organization the best chance of succeeding whilst also being able to support communities? And that's the kind of balance I think that's difficult to find all the time. Yeah. Thank you for your contribution, though. Yeah.
So our view is, so at the end, I think it depends on your strategy of open source. So if you're a simple customer, perhaps you don't need to contribute back. But let's imagine a real case, no? Kubernetes. If you invest a lot in Kubernetes and you have a specific flavor of Kubernetes with specific problems, and you want to influence the Kubernetes team to solve your problems, if you are just a simple customer, you won't be listened.
Yeah, I agree absolutely with that.
If you contribute, or if even you invest more and you become part of the core group, then you have this influence.
Yeah.
You can shape the future of them.
And
it depends on your strategy, right? Your customer, well, perhaps not. If it's part of your strategy, then you should invest more.
Yeah.
Invest more.
And that investment can take different, like, it can look different in different ways, right? Like, and it's all about where do you want to invest your company's resources to get the best bang for your buck? And I think that has to be the reality of the situation that we look at, right? Like, does it make sense for you to have a core Kubernetes contributor on staff, like, permanently? Like, is that a sensible business decision? Like, the answer is it depends. Like, it depends on your strategy, it depends on your approach, it depends on tons of stuff, right? But for lots of organizations, yeah.
Get more influence.
Yeah, but for lots of organizations it doesn't make sense, and the best way to influence those communities is through a vendor who's who's able to influence that situation. Yeah. Well, maybe. Yeah. I didn't want to say it, but I mean, if you want to say it, sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Like. If you leave with one thing from this talk, because I think we're going to get kicked out in a second, because 15 minutes is a really weird amount of time to talk for, is like, everything that we do is based on open source. It's a huge differentiator for organizations, and I just don't think they realize it. Like, I think it should be a board level conversation, if I'm totally honest. Like, the amount of innovation that is supported by it. And I think it's great that this community exists, that banks are coming and spending time, people who work there are dedicating their time to talk about what they're doing. It gives me great hope, actually, because without it, like, innovation is going to slow down, and the world's going to be a less exciting place to live in, and I want to live in an exciting world. So that's kind of the point of what I'm trying to say. But thank you so much for coming along.